Reporting research should be truthful and should not intentionally mislead. And unfortunately, during COVID-19, we've seen an increased prevalence of very questionable research. Secondly, research reports must be useful to all readers, including patients. There should be enough information provided to readers so that they can judge the validity and relevance of the study and act upon the findings. And finally, for those interested, reported research should enable replication of methods and results.
I think best practice is admitting the fact that there is no sort of right way to do research or science. There are simply, but I think many people would agree that there are some clearly sort of bad ways of doing it, and there are a collection of better ways of doing it. And what's more is that this expertise is not uniformly distributed through the community. I mean, there are places that are very good for, say, designing really clever and very interpretable experiments, but those may not be the same places that are filled with experts on MR physics.
Our reporting checklists are part of our larger push towards open science. And so here on this timeline, you can see the company-wide reproducibility checklists were rolled out in 2013, but that's been part of this sort of continual march towards promoting transparency and reproducibility in science.
How many papers, how many investigators, how many research consortia present their work in as positive a light as possible, and oftentimes, of course, that might mean emphasizing more favorable details and de-emphasizing less favorable details.
There is a huge amount of research suggesting that checklists are incredibly important, and they serve as aide-memoire for all of us. And they are a shortcut, brain on paper, that allows us to remember to say the things we need to say. They are necessary, I would argue, for good science to be done, certainly good science to be reported, but they're certainly not sufficient.
One is methods are very diverse. There are a lot of methods out there, even methods that have the same name when applied by different labs really might have other things under the hood. Many of the methods are excellent, but there are also methods that are really not excellent. And if you have garbage in, you will get garbage out. And even if you are able to reproduce the garbage, I would argue it's still not really what we want in science, right?
The Organization for Human and Brain Mapping back in 2014 realized that there was concern about the reliability of brain imaging research. And so a committee was formed, and I was asked to lead it, and was given the name the Committee on Best Practice and Data Analysis and Sharing.
That having some method, like checklists, can be a way of supporting transparency, rigor, and reproducibility in science, and saving us all a lot of headaches when we try to replicate each other.
At the core of many of the things we're doing, and that came up already, is reliability of what we're measuring and the tools that we're using to measure them. Embedded in a lot of these is concept validity, the clinical validity, predictive validity, longitudinal validity, clinical efficacy, and clinical utility. These are all different constructs to ask specific questions within the context of your study. But if your measure is not reliable, then you have a fundamental problem in actually even getting to these questions.
We need to be encouraging our funding agencies to see this as important. There have been occasional RFAs and calls for things that are methodologically focused. But I will say you see way more of those in terms of, advanced animal modeling, advanced other, like new instrumentation, those sorts of things. You don't very often see, we're going to have an RFA where the call is all going to be about how do we systematically enhance reliability for neuroimaging, for organoids, for this, for that, right? And that is something we need to be encouraging our funding agencies to do.
I think the benefit for authors really is that it provides guidance of what to report, right? So we no longer have to really worry about what do we report, and many authors report it, others don't. For editors, reviewers, and readers, it nicely summarizes the methodology, in my opinion. It provides sufficient detail, hopefully, to reproduce results, which I think is a key aspect. Standardization, systemizing results are further benefits, in my opinion.
I think there is no doubt that they improve the quality of the science, the transparency of the work that goes on, the reproducibility, and ultimately, of course, the real-world impact. Let's hope so. The reason we are even having this debate, of course, where we are, because there are problems with replication and there are problems with generalizability.
How many of you have had the experience of trying to replicate a published study and not finding the result that was in the study? So I'm seeing a lot of hands. So it just happened to me in my lab. So I tried to replicate a study, a very highly cited study that said that task-based fMRI was the more powerful way to target transcranial magnetic stimulation. So I tried to replicate this, didn't find the same results, and I asked the question, well, am I doing the task the same way as the author? Try to look very carefully in the methods section, and they didn't describe how much practice the subjects had received. And so I contacted the author because I assumed you're doing a task, you probably practiced the person up to a criterion. Turns out he didn't do that. He just instructed the subjects without practice, and not only was that missing from the methods section, but also that affects the interpretation of the paper.
Many of you have probably heard about this famous paper. It was an open science collaboration that tried to replicate 100 famous experiments in psychology, and they concluded that only about 40 of them were able to replicate, and 60% of them did not replicate. This has been discussed and debated. The point isn't really about the content of that, but about the notion that it's quite commonplace. In fact, it's routine to have non-replication also in psychiatry research.
Certain fields are changing very rapidly. Brain stimulation is one of them. And the technologies are increasingly complex. In order to thoroughly report exactly what you did, it takes more words, it takes more sections in your method section.
Journals can't do this on their own. Journals can definitely make a major impact of pulling their authors and reviewers on side, but it's really the field that has to do the work. But there's no doubt in my mind that full disclosure of experimental details will improve quality and ultimately generate knowledge and improve patient outcomes. So hopefully
would be to align, the family of journals that publish these clinical neuroscience, neuroimaging studies, and get us to all agree that we need a checklist of journals. And I think that's because there's a certain reluctance to rolling out a big checklist. You start to worry that the effort that is required to go into it will deter people from sending you their best work.
Yeah,
and so,
very much so.
if we, I think,
and that we feel that this is one of the important roles that journals are able to play in the community in terms of encouraging progress.
I think we bear the responsibility as a field, right? Like, we are the ones reviewing grants. We are the ones reviewing papers, right? We are the gatekeepers, right, in some sense. And so, we can certainly be arguing to our NIH, folks, program officers, and funding agency, but really, we do hold the power, right? If we, and don't shoot me because I say this, right? Like, if as reviewers of papers and grants, we start saying, this is important, give them funding to do this. They should have funding to do X, right? Ask for these RFAs. We can help change that behavior in the field.
A reporting guideline always includes a checklist, may include a flow diagram, always includes explicit text to guide authors in reporting a specific type of research, will most typically involve a consensus process. Carefully developed reporting guidelines provide authors with a minimum amount of information that needs to be reported, not a maximum amount of information. And reporting guidelines should be based on selection of items that are evidence-based whenever possible.
Remind us of the important things. They need to be good. They need to tell us what we need to know. So they need to be inclusive. They can't, I think, be dreamt up by a small group of people in a room. I think this is a process that requires expertise, diverse expertise, globally, within field, across career stages. Those of us who are not as young as we once were don't spend the time on at the cutting edge anymore. And we need early career researchers feeding into this. We need people from around the world, from different cultures, working in different ethical frameworks, working in different regulatory frameworks to come together to inform us.
So when you're trying to fill out a checklist, it's really important that we use the same words in the same way. And as fields develop, sometimes there's an evolving nomenclature. And there may be not a consistency in how we use nomenclature. Like with new emerging fields, we had to develop new nomenclatures. Brain stimulation is a great example of that, to keep pace with these rapid changes as we learn more and as we understand what aspects of methodology are important to report. An electronic version of that can automate using machine learning to extract some of the reporting items. These automated approaches could be really important. You know, we all want to comply with best practice, but we need some help here. We need some tools to make it less burdensome. And so the degree to which these things can be automated, that can help us all do what we want to do, which is to be thorough in our reporting.
These need to be living documents. They're not something that can just be written and forgotten about. They need to be revisited. They need to be thought about. There needs to be mechanisms by which alterations can be suggested. Those need to be taken on board, and that needs to be a formal dialogue continually, or at least regularly, to make these things as relevant as they can be. They need to be really clear.
And what we quickly realized is that it was impossible to tell people prospectively how to analyze their data, how to make it an experimental design, because they're so varied. And so we certainly, have put some general guidelines out there of sort of good ideas, but really what we focused on in these areas, especially in experimental design, acquisition, pre-processing, and results, was focus on the reporting. There is nothing more frustrating than trying to read a paper when you cannot figure out what they've done. We've all been there. I think that's basically what I wanted to say that the OHBM as an organization cares deeply about improving practice in neuroimaging research, and that fundamentally this is simply comprehensive reporting of what was done. And one way we try to advance this is through these COBIDAS reports.
Question is, as an intervention, do reporting guidelines work? Do they improve the completeness and transparency of reporting? I'm going to give you a couple of examples from the research we've done on CONSORT, which is a reporting guideline for randomized trials. We can see that over time, there's been a steady increase in instructions to authors that require them to use CONSORT. We also have primary research, such as randomized trials, that indicate the use of CONSORT improves the quality of reporting of randomized trials.
Adopted by any relevant journals. We shouldn't be able to circumvent their use by going to a different journal.
And here's our simple, this is the question. Did our compliance rates go up after we implemented the clinical trials project with all of the, detail, the minimal detail I told you about? And so, like I said, prior to implementation, September 1st, 22, we had 70 submissions and only 50% compliance. Okay, so here's what our most recent data. We've had 139 submissions, almost a doubling, and we're pretty broad at defining non-compliance.
I do think we have to find ways of informing guidelines and standards, and I'm not. I don't like top-down control. I'd like this to be a bottom-up process. So if we can come up with a group that proactively generates these guidelines and helps people to follow these guidelines.
It's our belief as the editors and the broader group, that says endorsement of counsel at ACNP, that this is the right way to go, that we want to emphasize rigor and transparency in reporting and adhere to these basic standards that have been, proposed and validated in our field. So,
but just giving you a few ideas, there are definitely challenges regarding how to develop a checklist, how to support development of a checklist. Do we have any funding opportunities for that? How to avoid, is there any pitfalls of using the checklist? How to facilitate the use of the checklist? How to engage other stakeholders, publishers, reviewers, funders, how the process is going to be? How to measure adherence and impact, as we have been discussing. How do we kind of follow and measure the impact? And how to update the checklist based on the evidence in the field, how that is going to happen. What would be the development cycle of a checklist? So we can think about what is the problem? What is the problem that we are interested to have a checklist for it? What is really happening in the field? What is the kind of the current status of the field? Who are the main people who have the energy and motivation to get together to develop the checklist? And how the consensus is going to happen, how they are going to decide which item is going to end up to the checklist or not, and how they are going to test it in a reality and say how they can measure the level of adherence over the time and how that is going to be updated. So all those kind of things that we are thinking about, how that is going to be a developmental cycle over the time, which is going to cover the entire spectrum of a research project, right? From when you develop the question to the end that you want to make sure that there would be a data sharing and reproducibility and how people are going to reproduce what you have done and replicate what you have done. In that entire process, how different checklists addressed all these different aspects of the research. And as you can see here, different checklists have different level of engagement with all these different steps of the research.
What are the qualities that within a field that advance reliability, replicability? And we can look to fields that have really struggled with this. Aviation, for example, is a field that has struggled with it. And then from people like Atul Gawande, the Checklist Manifesto, medical care, hospitals, surgical care, right? I could be provocative and ask how many people here have had an operation or been in the hospital lately. And anyone who has knows that there are 4 key qualities to institutional reliability. And I'm going to give you my version of them. First, it's annoying. Second, it's burdensome. Third, it's costly. And fourth, everyone has to be involved. So if you go into the hospital, you get asked your name 1,000 times. And everyone asks you, one person walks in, one person walks out, next person walks in, asks you the same thing. They want to see your wristband, they want to see your name, they want to see the thing, they want to make sure you're the right person, you're in the right room, you're getting the right treatment, you're getting the right procedure, you're getting the right drug, you're getting, and then they ask you all kinds of things. What are you allergic to? What are you getting? What are your medications? What are you blah, blah, blah? And it drives you crazy. But in the end, they operate on the right leg. The correct leg, I should say. Right? Everyone is involved, and everyone who has a stake has a responsibility. I think one of the things you heard today is that if we want to solve these problems, the same 4 principles of reliability will apply. First, we're going to come up with things like checklists. And then we may have a checklist for checklists, and probably as a result, a checklist on checklists of checklists. And we are going to need to make sure that the information that other people need to replicate the research is present in the papers, is alluded to in the grants, is available to the grant reviewers. The grant reviewers have to be looking for it. They need to be holding the scientists accountable. The editors need to be looking for this in the paper. The reviewers of papers need to be looking for this. And we need to police our industry, if you will, to make sure that the end results can have the kind of impact that justifies the hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent each year in doing this kind of work.
We shared the ideas with some other major neuroscience journal editors during last 2 weeks. So we started to just basically send emails to other journal editors and ask them about what they think about the kind of methodological checklist and how that is going to be implemented. And so far, these are the journal editors that we receive feedbacks from them, or we receive a feedback from editor-in-chief that this specific person in our journal is going to be responsible for this, and we are really interested to be a part of that process. So from Nature Medicine, Lancet Psychiatry, Neuron, Nature Methods, Journal of Neuroscience, Human Brain Mapping, Nature Protocols, Nature Mental Health. So you can see that there is a sort of a large community of journal editors who are interested in this discussion. And what we are going to do after kind of wrapping up this session, first of all, we are going to have a webinar. So that is the QR code for a webinar that we are going to have on Tuesday, February 6th for 2 hours. And this webinar is going to open the discussion to a larger community. And we are inviting those who are interested to be a part of this discussion to just basically scan the QR code and register for that webinar that we are going to have.